In the history of Western Christianity, there has often been a misunderstanding about Jesus' teaching of love in many churches. These misunderstandings often involve the command Jesus gives today in our gospel reading: love your enemies and pray for those who abuse you. In the past, these verses were used to tell enslaved people in America not to resist their enslavement. These verses are sometimes used even today to tell a person to remain in a marriage or a relationship when they are being abused. It's easy to see how the command to love your enemies, when taken out of context, provides moral cover for violent or inappropriate behavior. It can trap victims of abuse and excuse perpetrators, all in the name of Christian teaching. I don't know about you, but hearing Jesus say, love your enemies, is especially upsetting right now. If I hear it as a command to passively conjure up emotions of benevolence, warm fuzzies towards leaders in our state and in our country who are wreaking social havoc and doing harm to people we love. I don't want to hear love your enemy as I watch people with power tear apart the social fabric of our society, often for financial gain or as political theater. As is always the case, an accurate interpretation of our gospel text emerges when we understand the social context in which Jesus was speaking at that time. At that time, the Roman government ruled that area. They were an occupying force who had entered the land, conquered through violence, and controlled the conquered peoples through threat of death. In almost every way, to be Roman was to be dominant over non-Roman people. Conversely, to be a Jew was to be the people who were conquered. Romans had entered and stolen your lands and now taxed and controlled you through constant military presence with no regard for your rights or wishes. In other words, Romans were first-class citizens, Jews were second-class citizens. Therefore, Jewish folks in Jesus' day had few human rights, and Roman soldiers often exploited that fact. Roman soldiers used physical harm as an intimidation factor to keep Jewish people in line. The constant low-level threat of violence from Romans tamped down the Jews and helped prevent a rising tide of rebellion. In other words, most Jews at some point in Jesus' time would have witnessed a Roman soldier striking a Jewish person on the cheek to keep them in line. That was an everyday occurrence in that world. With that context in mind, I've invited our brave volunteer, Nancy, to come up here and help me imagine the choreography, if you want to stand over here, Nancy, of what Jesus is talking about in this passage. And when we understand the choreography, a totally different idea emerges from the text. To aid us, I also want to utilize the specific command that Jesus gives in Matthew. There's a parallel teaching in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount that adds a couple of words that are important for our understanding. And in Matthew, Jesus adds one word. He says, when someone strikes your right cheek, turn the other cheek also. So that gives us a better idea of what Jesus has in mind. So Nancy, large and intimidating as she is, she's going to be the Roman soldier, and I'm going to be the Jewish peasant, right? A few things you need to know. In that world, the left hand was used for private acts, and was considered unclean. The right hand was considered the hand you used for public acts, like eating or like fighting. So if a Roman soldier was going to strike you, it would have been with the right hand. Second thing to know, how you strike someone communicates what you believe about their social status and the power between you. So, if you strike somebody with a fist, that's saying you are my equal. Like a Roman would fight another Roman with fists, right? But if you slap someone, like a backhanded slap, that symbolizes domination and subordination. In that world, when you slapped somebody with the back of your hand, you weren't doing it to harm them physically, you were doing it to harm them psychologically, to say, I have power over you. Does that make sense so far? So, here's our Roman soldier that's going to use their right hand. If she's going to hit me, which cheek is she going to hit me on using a backhand? The right cheek, which matches Jesus' description. When someone hits you on the right, not if someone, when someone hits you on the right cheek. So that sounds like Jesus had probably been hit on the right cheek before by a Roman soldier, right? And maybe seen a lot of his friends or family members also struck in that same way with the right cheek, symbolizing domination, subordination. Then what does Jesus say? So go ahead and again, when someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. So that indicates moving to a posture that's like this, facing my left cheek towards you. If you're going to hit me with your right hand, you can't slap me again. It leaves you just one choice, right? You're going to have to hit me with your fist on my left cheek. Thank you. So this turning of the other cheek would have left Roman soldiers in an awkward position. They walk away, embarrassed that they'd been outsmarted, or they strike the Jewish peasant with a fist, basically acknowledging the Jewish peasant as an equal human being. Knowing this context completely changes our understanding of Jesus' command here to love our enemies. Most of Jesus' audience probably had only imagined there were two responses to this Roman abuse, neither of which helped them. There was fight and there was flight. So fight would have looked like after I'm struck, one, I could become violent in response, right? I can hit back with my fist. We know that Jesus was nonviolent and taught not to become the thing that you hated, right? Don't become like the Romans. Also, much more pragmatically, Jesus was smart because he knew that if you're going to seek revenge in that way, these soldiers are going to wipe us out, right? That's not a smart move, just in terms of the basics of survival. So fighting with fists, fighting might with might, wasn't really a smart option. But Jesus also doesn't teach flight, right? He doesn't say let them continue to slap with the back of their hands. He doesn't teach them to accept Roman control over their lives and this narrative that they are dominating over us. Jesus introduces this third way in his sermon. The third way allowed poor Jews to stand up to Romans, humiliate them for their violent conduct, and force them into a situation of acknowledging these peasants as equals. In other words, even in a situation where Jesus and his community had less political power, he taught them how to assert their dignity as beloved children of God whose worth was equal to their Roman overlords. For a Jew like Jesus to turn the other cheek was a clever and courageous way to say to a Roman soldier, you do not have power over my mind. You do not have the power to make me believe that I am subordinate to you. I'm asserting my dignity even in the face of brutality. Martin Luther King Jr., many years later, would brilliantly summarize this third way like this, quote, one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, so that love is identified as a resignation of power, and power is defined as a denial of love. Now, we have to get this thing right. What is needed is the realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is just sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. Now keep in mind that Jesus wasn't just instructing an individual to do this, he was instructing an entire community. So imagine if a whole community of Jewish peasants started turning the other cheek in this way and taking other additional creative, assertive actions to subvert Roman efforts to demoralize their group. They would be like tiny grains of sand. First there's one, and then there are 12, and then there are tens, and then there are hundreds. And then eventually there were thousands of Christians clogging up the gears of an empire that sought to trample and destroy people. Jesus' advice here formed a community of people who were militantly resisting the brainwashing of an empire who was hell-bent on convincing them that they were worthless and they were powerless. Jesus' instruction here, counseling this third way of asserting one's dignity through nonviolence, this is what inspired Gandhi's organizing that helped free India from British control. He read the Sermon on the Mount every day. Jesus' instruction here is what grounded the civil rights movement that helped secure numerous policy advancements for black people and working people of all colors in America in the 1960s. His instructions are what some in those movements came to call soul force, or truth force, or love force. So no, when Jesus says love your enemies, he's not saying crumple into a despondent doormat. He's saying even if you don't have the most political power, you still have the power together to assert your dignity and rights through nonviolent resistance, powered by God's Spirit. Well, what does this mean for us? If you are struggling right now, it's okay not to feel brave. It's okay to take breaks. It's okay to curl up sometimes in self-preservation and care for yourself. Part of living by love is this command to love yourself, especially in hard times. And also, this radical Jesus invites us into charging our love with power to act, especially in situations where we hold more privilege, especially if the changes happening around us are more immediately threatening to our neighbors than to us. To be Christian right now means to courageously stand in the way of all that will harm vulnerable people. To be Christian right now means to be assertive, creative, and disruptive of every force that tries to make vulnerable people subordinate. We as a community have the power to say, no matter what happens, we do not consent to actions and stories that deny the dignity of every human being. I do not consent to public school funding for Iowa that doesn't keep up with the rate of inflation. Children can't vote, and so adults are supposed to stand up for their dignity. We're supposed to make sure that they don't just get the crumbs, the bare minimum. I don't consent to the financial neglect of hundreds of thousands of children who need strong public education. I do not consent to current policy efforts to remove gender identity as a protected class in the Iowa Civil Rights Act. HB 242, the passage of this bill would mean that Iowa would no longer prohibit discrimination in business or in housing or education or employment or in financial services when it comes to gender identity. These decisions from our leaders are a failure to recognize the dignity of every person in this state and to do right by them. I want to name two particular ways we could act in the short term around these issues. One of them is that there is a hearing tomorrow, Monday at 11 a.m. at the State House in room 103 for public comment on this bill that proposes taking civil rights away from people because of their gender identity or removing those protections. A number of us are going to be going. I would love for you to consider being there and speaking out, or at least just being physically present. Second, another fantastic way we'll be standing up together in this upcoming Episcopalians on the Hill Day on March 11th. That March 11th event is an opportunity to do exactly what Jesus is talking about, to stand together and advocate people in positions of power, to demand that the dignity of every person is respected. That day includes some training. If you're new at this, if it's a little bit intimidating, there's training. There's also time to speak to our representatives, and that will culminate in an event with One Iowa to support LGBTQ folks at the Capitol in our state. So I invite you to please come talk to me, talk to Lizzie. I think there are people from here carpooling tomorrow to go down to the State House together. Those are a couple concrete things that we can do. My friends, we are turning the other cheek to demand that every human being is valued, provided for, and protected. We are the loving little pieces of sand clogging the gears of machines that seek to trample on God's creation and all of God's people. Amen.